Brother, did the flames refine you? Sister, did the flames refine you? Ooh.
From the earliest stories we told around fires, we sensed that darkness was not only around us but within us. We spoke of devils, tempters, serpents, and hidden impulses because we felt their breath behind our good intentions. We prayed to God for protection, yet somewhere deep inside, we knew that what we feared most was already a part of us. Carl Jung called that inner darkness the shadow, the sum of all that we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. It is the impulse we repress, the desire we condemn, the envy we deny, the anger we disguise as virtue. When we turn our eyes toward God, the image of absolute light, we inevitably cast a long, private darkness behind us. We fear this shadow because it whispers the possibility that we are not purely good, that beneath our politeness and piety there lives an animal, a liar, a coward, or a tyrant. To meet God, we imagine we must kill this darker twin. But Jung reminds us that God is not reached by denial. The road to the divine passes straight through the valley of the shadow. We are creatures of tension between the heaven we long for and the chaos we carry. The more devout our outer life becomes, the more violently the repressed shadow presses from beneath. History itself is testimony. Saints who preached love yet lived with unconfessed rage. Movements that sought paradise but birthed hell. Every unintegrated shadow eventually manifests in the world. When we look honestly at our lives, we see how subtle this fear is. We hide behind the masks of busyness, of moral superiority, of certainty. We say, "I'm fine," while our forgotten emotions leak out as sarcasm, resentment, or quiet despair. Each time we condemn another person's sin, we may be projecting our own unseen darkness onto them. As Jung wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. To fear the shadow, then, is to misunderstand God. For if God is truly infinite, then even the parts of us we despise must somehow be held within the divine. The shadow is not outside of creation. It is a fragment of the same wholeness we call God. It is our task not to worship darkness, but to bring it into dialogue with the light, to let the two speak until something larger than either emerges. Imagine a mirror placed in the sun. If the mirror turns away, it reflects nothing. If it faces the light too directly, it is blinded. But at the right angle, the mirror glows. It becomes a meeting place of radiance and reflection. That is what Jung meant by individuation, the slow turning of the soul until both light and darkness are seen as parts of a greater image. When we begin this work, fear arises first. Fear that if we open the box of our suppressed self, we will drown in it. Fear that acknowledging hatred or lust or pride will make us unworthy before God. But the truth is the opposite. Until we open that box, we cannot be whole enough to love, to create, or to pray honestly. The parts we refuse to face become the very demons we later fight. The shadow does not vanish through exorcism, but through conversation. We sit with it, name it, and listen. We learn that the shadow is not only the source of sin, but also of vitality. Within it lie our unused gifts, our courage, our passion, our creative fire. The same energy that can destroy can also heal when turned toward love. When Jung wrote about God, he did not mean only a theological idea. He meant the living experience of an objective inner presence, a power that speaks in dreams, symbols, and conscience. This God, he said, seeks realization through the human soul. Thus, to fear our shadow is to resist God's own movement within us, because God too wishes to integrate the dark and the light. In myths, heroes descend before they rise. Christ goes into the desert, Buddha faces Mara, Jonah sinks into the whale. Each story tells us the same law. Only what is faced can be redeemed. We fear our shadow because we forget this sacred pattern. We want resurrection without crucifixion, enlightenment without night. But God meets us exactly where we fall. The shadow is the gate. When we confess our brokenness, not theatrically but truthfully, we open a space for grace. It is there that transformation begins, not in moral perfection, but in humility. Jung called this the religious function of the psyche, the instinct in us that moves toward wholeness, toward the divine center he named the self. The self in Jung's language is not our ego, it is the totality of who we are, known and unknown, human and divine. When we approach it, our images of God shift from projection to participation. We stop speaking about God as something distant and begin to sense God moving within the drama of our own becoming. Every encounter with the shadow is an invitation to that deeper center. And yet, most of us resist. We prefer clear villains and clear heroes. We prefer to think the evil is out there. But the moment we split the world that way, we lose sight of our own complicity. The wars between nations begin as wars within hearts. To reconcile with our shadow is therefore not a private luxury, it is an act of collective redemption. In the quiet of reflection, we might ask, what part of myself have I cast out in the name of goodness? Is it the child who wanted attention, the angry one, the sensual one, the doubter? Whatever we exile becomes the ghost that haunts us. To bring it home is painful, yes, but it is also holy. For God's light is not fragile. It does not need our censorship. It needs our honesty. When we finally stop running, when we turn around and look into that inner darkness, something unexpected happens. We find eyes looking back, not demonic, but deeply human. We realize that the shadow we feared was only the part of us that wanted to be loved without conditions. And in that recognition, the boundary between our darkness and God's mercy begins to dissolve. Fear of the shadow is rarely obvious. It hides itself behind the masks we learn to wear long before we can name them. We call them personality, virtue, professionalism. But each mask has a function. It protects the fragile image we want the world to see. Jung called this the persona, the face that mediates between our inner life and society. The persona is not evil, it is necessary. Without it, we would have no language for relationship. But when we begin to believe that the mask is who we are, the shadow thickens behind it. The more polished the mask, the more we fear what lies beneath. We smile, we speak kindly, we perform goodness, and yet a quiet exhaustion follows us home, the fatigue of perpetual disguise. Religious cultures often perfect this performance. We learn how a saint should sound, how a believer should behave. We quote scripture, suppress anger and discipline desire. But beneath our piety, the shadow whispers that it still exists. In churches, temples, and mosques, people confess to their gods, but rarely to themselves. We tell God what we think He wants to hear, not what actually burns inside us. Thus, devotion becomes another layer of denial. The irony is that God cannot be deceived. In the language of Jung, the divine image within, the self, responds not to moral posturing, but to authenticity. Every false prayer deepens the split between the ego and the self. The soul grows ill, not because God withholds grace, but because we withhold truth. We have mistaken repression for repentance. To integrate the shadow is therefore an act of honesty before God. It is to say, here is the part of me that hates, that envies, that lusts, that doubts, not to justify it, but to acknowledge it. Only when the contents of the unconscious are brought to light can they be transformed. Jung once said that he would rather be whole than good. He did not mean that goodness is worthless, but that wholeness contains a goodness far deeper than moral appearance, the goodness that arises when opposites reconcile. Fear of the shadow is rarely obvious. It hides itself behind the masks we learn to wear long before we can name them. We call them personality, virtue, professionalism, but each mask has a function. It protects the fragile image we want the world to see. Jung called this the persona, the face that mediates between our inner life and society. The persona is not evil, it is necessary. Without it, we would have no language for relationship. But when we begin to believe that the mask is who we are, the shadow thickens behind it. The more polished the mask, the more we fear what lies beneath. We smile, we speak kindly, we perform goodness, and yet a quiet exhaustion follows us home, the fatigue of perpetual disguise. Religious cultures often perfect this performance. We learn how a saint should sound, how a believer should behave. We quote scripture, suppress anger, and discipline desire. When we fear the shadow, morality turns into moralism. We become judges rather than healers. Our ethics lose warmth and become weapons. We measure others by the standards we secretly fail to meet. This projection is one of the most destructive forces in human history. A nation denies its own aggression and therefore imagines enemies everywhere. A community represses sexuality and therefore obsesses over the sins of others. An individual hides insecurity and therefore mocks the vulnerable. Each act of projection is a way of saying, it is not I, it is them. In theological terms, it is the refusal of confession. True confession, Jung might say, is psychological as well as spiritual. It is not the performance of guilt, but the surrender of illusion. When we confess, we dismantle the mask and allow the rejected self to speak. Sometimes it weeps, sometimes it rages, sometimes it simply sighs with relief. In that moment, something of God's compassion enters because compassion requires reality. Grace cannot touch what we pretend to be, it can only heal what we reveal. If the shadow shows us our hidden darkness, God shows us our hidden light, yet the two are mirrors of one another. When we imagine God as pure perfection, separate from the flawed human world, we exile both the divine and the shadow. We project holiness upward and darkness downward, splitting the cosmos in two. But the psyche longs for unity. Thus we alternate between worship and despair, between feeling close to God and unworthy of Him. The oscillation continues until we realize that God's light does not exclude the places we fear to enter. Jung described religious experience as a numinous encounter, something that overwhelms reason and forces the ego to bow. In such moments, the soul glimpses its own depth. Sometimes this happens in beauty, sometimes in terror, a dream, a crisis, an illness. Anything that cracks the shell of self-control can open the way. We may call it grace, fate, or synchronicity, but its effect is the same. The boundaries between the human and the divine blur. And yet, when this encounter comes, our first reaction is often panic. We flee to doctrines or distractions because the real presence of God threatens our carefully built identity. If the divine truly lives within us, then our shadow is also seen by that same light. The meeting is too intimate. We feel naked before eternity, so we build theology as armor. We define God in safe concepts, we debate, we preach. Meanwhile, the living fire cools into words. Jung observed that every revelation tends to harden into religion, and every religion eventually must be renewed by another revelation. The cycle repeats because the ego cannot permanently domesticate the divine. There comes a period in every sincere seeker's life when the old images collapse. What once felt certain begins to tremble. The prayers that used to comfort bring only silence. This is what mystics call the dark night of the soul. From a Jungian view, it is the stage when the ego, stripped of its illusions, meets the shadow in full. We often interpret this darkness as abandonment by God, but it is the opposite. It is the moment when God refuses to be our projection. The divine presence withdraws its familiar face so that a deeper union may occur. Our task is not to escape the night, but to remain in it until new eyes are given. In psychological language, this is the descent into the unconscious. The dreams become vivid, the emotions roar, the old defenses useless. We may feel madness approaching, yet beneath the chaos, a new order is forming. If we endure, the symbols begin to speak, light emerging from shadow, resurrection following death. Jung compared this to alchemy, the ancient art of turning base metal into gold. The alchemists projected their inner process onto matter. They heated and dissolved and purified, mirroring the soul's own transformation. To integrate the shadow is to perform this inner alchemy, to let the opposites cook together until something incorruptible is born. That something is the self, the image of God realized within human form. In every culture, the divine is imagined in symbols of wholeness, the circle, the mandala, the radiant heart. Jung found such images appearing spontaneously in dreams of patients who had never heard of them. He concluded that the idea of God is not imported by culture, but arises naturally from the psyche striving toward unity. The self is that center and circumference of the soul. It is both personal and transpersonal, the I that we are and the greater I in which we move. When we draw near to it, we sense God not as an external ruler, but as the life that breathes through all things. This does not mean that the divine is merely psychological. Rather, the psyche is one of the places where the divine chooses to appear. To live from the self is to see with double vision, to recognize that every virtue casts a shadow and every vice hides a fragment of light. Love and hate, faith and doubt, joy and sorrow, they dance as opposites within the one reality. Wholeness does not eliminate tension, it sustains it in harmony. In this sense, salvation is not escape, but integration. Still, we resist. We prefer a God who rescues us from the conflict, not one who invites us deeper into it. We want certainty, not paradox. But paradox is the language of the soul. When we learn to hold opposites, the heart widens. Compassion replaces judgment. We see that every sinner is a mirror of ourselves, every saint a reminder of what we could become. We begin to understand why Christ embraced both thieves on the cross, one who mocked, one who repented. Between them hung the symbol of reconciliation, the meeting of light and darkness within divine love. Whether one interprets this story religiously or psychologically, the message is the same. God's mercy reaches through shadow, not around it. When we fear our own shadow, we split the image of God. We create heaven without earth, spirit without body, holiness without humanity. But a divided image cannot sustain faith. It collapses into hypocrisy or despair. Only when the divine and the human meet inside us do we find peace. Integration begins in small, ordinary moments, a conversation in which we tell the truth instead of the convenient lie, a memory we allow ourselves to feel instead of suppressing, a prayer spoken from weakness rather than strength. Each honest act draws a bit of the shadow into light. We discover that the parts we feared most are not annihilated but transformed. Anger becomes courage, envy becomes admiration, desire becomes creativity. The energy locked in darkness is released for life. The ego, humble but not destroyed, becomes a servant of the self rather than its rival. In that posture, faith becomes less about belief and more about relationship. We no longer demand that God fit our image. We allow ourselves to be remade in His. And as the ego surrenders, a strange joy arises, a quiet confidence that even our flaws belong to a larger wholeness. The fear of the shadow fades, replaced by reverence for the mystery that contains both shadow and light. When the inner work begins to take root, the world around us starts to change, not because reality itself alters, but because our way of seeing deepens. The faces we meet each day no longer divide so easily into friend and foe. We sense the same conflict of light and darkness moving in every heart. The driver who cuts us off, the neighbor whose politics offend us, the stranger who frightens us, they are no longer pure adversaries but living reminders of our own unseen pieces. To live with this awareness is demanding. It asks us to stay awake in moments when we would rather retreat into certainty. But the reward is freedom. We are no longer controlled by what we deny. The shadow still moves, but we can recognize its footsteps and choose our response. Where once there was fear, there is curiosity. Where once there was judgment, there is compassion. Integration does not mean perfection. It means that the fragments of our being have begun to speak to one another. Our thoughts and feelings no longer wage secret wars. We begin to act from a center that can hold contradiction without breaking. This, Jung said, is the meaning of maturity, the ability to bear the tension of opposites until a higher unity emerges. In spiritual language, that unity is love, not sentimental affection, but the love that looks at reality and says, yes, even this. Such love is not blind. It sees clearly the cruelty, the injustice, the failure in the world, yet refuses to turn those facts into reasons for hatred. It holds everything in the heart's wider field, trusting that nothing real is wasted in the eyes of God. Every authentic religious tradition at its core returns to this truth. The mystics of all ages, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, speak of a love that unites the opposites. Jung read these writings not as escapes from the world, but as the fulfillment of psychological wholeness. For love is the force that allows consciousness to include what it once rejected. It is the bridge between ego and self, human and divine. When we love, we participate in God's own nature. To love another person in their totality, including their shadow, is to enact the very compassion that God shows toward us. To love ourselves in that same way is not vanity, it is obedience to truth. We become mirrors in which the divine sees itself reflected, dark and light together. Love transforms projection into relationship. Instead of condemning the darkness we see in others, we learn to hold it with understanding. Instead of idealizing goodness in distant heroes, we recognize its possibility within. The world becomes less a battlefield and more a conversation between souls in different stages of remembering who they are. Our individual work ripples outward. A community that faces its shadow begins to heal its divisions. A nation that admits its wrongs gains the chance to atone rather than repeat them. We cannot purify society by purging its sinners. We can only transform it by integrating its truths. When enough individuals undertake this inner reconciliation, collective consciousness shifts. Jung warned that modern humanity risks destruction not because of external forces alone, but because of what lies unrecognized in our own psyche. The weapons of war, he said, are projections of the inner barbarian. If we would disarm the world, we must first disarm ourselves. The confrontation with the shadow is therefore not a private indulgence, it is a moral responsibility. Wholeness, then, is not an abstract achievement, it is a daily practice. It happens when we forgive, when we apologize, when we listen. It happens when we create art, raise children, cook, or garden with awareness that the ordinary is holy. Jung often said that the soul is found in small things, in the neglected corners of life. Every moment offers material for transformation if we meet it honestly. There will still be days of shadow, of course. Old patterns return, wounds reopen, fears resurface. But now we know what is happening. We no longer mistake the night for the end of the world. We can say, the shadow has come to teach again. And in that recognition, the darkness loses its power to terrify. To walk this path is to accept that spiritual growth is spiral, not linear. We revisit the same lessons at deeper levels each time with more humility and less panic. God's presence becomes less an occasional visitation and more a quiet companionship. The distance between prayer and breathing diminishes until the two are one. As we continue, the image of God also evolves. We begin to sense the divine not merely as a judge above us, but as a life within us and beyond us at once. God becomes less an object of belief and more a relationship of participation. In Jung's words, the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. The small I bows before the larger mystery that has guided every step of our becoming. In that surrender, paradoxically, we find our true individuality. For the ego that yields to the self does not vanish. It becomes transparent, allowing the divine light to pass through without distortion. We become unique expressions of the same infinite source, different faces of the one image. This is the meaning of the phrase imago Dei, the image of God realized in human form. To live from that center is to see creation with reverence. The animals, the forests, the cities, the strangers, all are threads in the same divine fabric. The fear of the shadow dissolves into awe, because we recognize that even the dark soil is necessary for the flower to bloom. We stop dividing life into sacred and profane. Everything becomes participation in God's unfolding. One day, we noticed that the questions that once tormented us, am I good enough? Does God love me? What if my darkness is unforgivable? No longer dominate our thoughts. They have not been answered in words but dissolved in understanding. We see that the love we sought was never withheld. It was only waiting for us to stop hiding. We realized that God was present even in our denial, guiding us through failure toward truth. This realization does not make us saints. It makes us real. We laugh more easily, grieve more deeply, forgive more quickly. The opposites within us continue their dance, but now the music is heard as harmony rather than conflict. Light and shadow become two hands of the same Creator shaping our soul, and when suffering comes, as it inevitably does, we no longer ask, "Why me?" Instead we ask, "What is this trying to reveal?" Pain becomes dialogue, not punishment. Through every loss, the self calls us back to wholeness. Through every joy, it reminds us that wholeness is already here. The integration of the shadow is not a destination, but an attitude toward life. It is the willingness to meet whatever arises with honesty and faith. It is the courage to believe that God's image includes our imperfections, our doubts, our humanity entire. We will fall again, we will forget again, but each return deepens the circle of understanding. At last we come to see that what we called the shadow was never our enemy. It was the dark womb of transformation, the secret companion of light. To fear it was to fear our own becoming. To embrace it is to welcome the whole of God's creation within ourselves. And so we walk on, imperfect, luminous, carrying both night and day in our hearts. We pray, we work, we love, we fail, we rise. Each act becomes a step in the eternal dialogue between the human and the divine. And in the quiet that follows, we sense a whisper, not from above, but from within.